They called her the girl who walked away from a dying queen's world, and somehow survived the woman who replaced it. In a court haunted by Catherine of Aragon's ghost and ruled by Anne Boleyn's daughter, one lady-in-waiting chose loyalty over survival. Tonight, step into the shadows with Jane Dormer, the servant who refused to let the old queen be erased. If you're ready for the side of Tudor history they tried to bury, stay with this story and slip your finger on that subscribe button like a silent oath of loyalty. England, 1533. A kingdom was being rewritten, and its ink was the blood of a discarded queen. For 24 years, Catherine of Aragon had ruled beside Henry VIII as his wife and England's anointed queen, Spanish princess, widow of his brother, mother to his only surviving legitimate child, Princess Mary. She had given him everything except the one thing that mattered, a son. By the time the spring of 1533 arrived, Catherine had already been erased in all but name. Henry had banished her from court 2 years earlier, ripping away her title, her household, her dignity. Her rooms at Greenwich Palace, where she had once presided over feasts and received ambassadors, were given to another woman, Anne Boleyn, the dark-eyed lady-in-waiting who had refused to be a mistress and demanded to be a queen. Henry did not wait for permission. In January of 1533, he married Anne in secret while still legally bound to Catherine. The ceremony was quiet, performed in the dead of winter with only a handful of witnesses. No fanfare, no papal blessing, just a king who had decided that his will was now the law of God. 3 months later, a newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury named Thomas Cranmer convened a court. On the 23rd of May, he declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. It had never existed, he said. 24 years, erased with the stroke of a pen. 5 days later, Cranmer validated the marriage to Anne. The woman who had waited 7 years in the shadows was now, by English law, the rightful Queen of England. On the 1st of June, Anne Boleyn rode in triumph through the streets of London. Dressed in robes of purple velvet and ermine, her long dark hair flowing free beneath a circlet of gold and gemstones, she was carried from the Tower to Westminster Abbey. Crowds lined the route, watching in silence as the procession passed. Some cheered, many did not. The spectacle was designed to prove one thing: Anne Boleyn was no mistress elevated by lust. She was a consecrated queen, crowned and anointed, carrying the heir to England's throne in her womb. But in a cold stone chamber far from the pageantry, Catherine of Aragon refused to disappear. Stripped of her crown, forbidden even the title of queen, she was addressed now only as the Dowager Princess of Wales, widow of Henry's dead brother Arthur. It was an insult designed to break her. It did not. She was moved from estate to estate, each one smaller and more isolated than the last. Finally, in 1534, she was sent to Kimbleton Castle in the damp flatlands of Cambridgeshire. There, she locked herself in a single room, attended by a handful of loyal servants. She wore the rough hair shirt of a Franciscan beneath her gown. She fasted, she prayed, and she wrote letters in secret to her daughter Mary, whom Henry had forbidden her to see. Catherine of Aragon would die in that room 2 years later, on a frozen January morning in 1536, calling herself queen until her last breath. But her ghost would haunt the Tudor court for decades. Catherine's ghost was not the only one that would walk the halls of Tudor England. The cost of putting Anne Boleyn on the throne was paid in blood, faith, and the fracturing of an entire kingdom's soul. Henry had not simply divorced a wife. He had torn England away from the Catholic Church that had governed Christian Europe for 1,000 years. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage to Catherine, Henry decided he no longer needed Rome's permission for anything. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the King of England the supreme head of the Church of England. With one document, Henry had made himself both king and pope on English soil. It was a revolution disguised as a marriage dispute, and revolutions demand martyrs. The first to die were those who dared to say the king was wrong. Sir Thomas More, once Henry's most trusted adviser and Lord Chancellor of England, refused to acknowledge the annulment or accept Henry as head of the church. More was no fool. He knew what his silence would cost him. He resigned his office, retreated to his home, and tried to avoid the question altogether. But silence was not enough. In April of 1534, he was arrested and locked in the Tower of London. For 15 months, he remained imprisoned in a cold cell, his family begging him to take the oath. He would not. On the 6th of July, 1535, Thomas More was led to the scaffold on Tower Hill. A crowd gathered to watch. He was calm, almost serene, as he mounted the steps. He joked with the executioner, adjusted his beard so the blade would not catch it, and knelt. One swing of the axe, and the man who had once been the king's dearest friend was gone. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge as a warning to anyone else who might place God above their king. He was not alone. John Fisher, the elderly Bishop of Rochester, had also refused the oath. Fisher was over 70 years old, frail and nearly blind, but his defiance was absolute. He had been Catherine of Aragon's confessor and her fiercest defender. He called Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn a sin and a scandal. For that, he was dragged to the same scaffold only weeks before More. His body was so weak that guards had to help him to the block. But his words were iron. He died declaring Catherine the true queen. More than 2 men fell in those years. Across England, monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized, their monks scattered or executed if they resisted. Ancient abbeys that had stood for centuries were torn down, their treasures melted, their libraries burned. Priests who refused to accept the new order were hanged. Nuns were forced from their convents. The religious landscape of England was being erased and rebuilt in Henry's image, all so Anne Boleyn could wear a crown. But the people did not forget. In the markets and alehouses, they whispered that the king had been bewitched, that Anne was a sorceress who had seduced him with dark magic, that God would punish England for abandoning the true faith and the true queen. They were right about the punishment. They were only wrong about who would suffer it first. While men burned and monasteries crumbled, there was another victim being slowly destroyed in plain sight. Princess Mary, Catherine of Aragon's only surviving child, was 17 years old when her world collapsed. In September of 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth. The child was a girl named Elizabeth. Henry had been so certain of a son that the official proclamation announcing the birth had already been written with the word Prince. Clerks had to squeeze an extra letter into the parchment at the last moment to make it read Princess. It was a humiliation for Anne, but a catastrophe for Mary. Within weeks, Parliament passed the Act of Succession. It declared that only the children of Henry and Anne had the right to inherit the throne. Mary, who had been heir to England since birth, was now legally erased. She was no longer a princess. She was no longer legitimate. She was simply the Lady Mary, and the title was spoken like an insult. Her household was dissolved. The women who had served her since childhood, including the Countess of Salisbury, who had been like a second mother to her, were dismissed. In December of 1533, Mary was ordered to join the household of the infant Elizabeth at Hatfield Palace. She was not going as an honored elder sister. She was going as a servant, a lady in waiting to a baby. It was designed to break her, and it nearly did. Mary was forbidden to see her mother. Catherine was locked away in her damp exile at Kimbleton, and Henry made it clear that if Mary tried to visit, she would never be allowed back. Letters were intercepted. Messengers were turned away. Mother and daughter, who had been inseparable, were kept apart for the last 3 years of Catherine's life. When Catherine died in January of 1536, Mary was not permitted to attend her funeral. On the same day Catherine of Aragon was being buried, Anne Boleyn miscarried. She had been pregnant again, and this time it had been a boy. The loss shattered whatever remained of Henry's affection for her. He had destroyed his kingdom's faith, executed his friends, and cast aside a beloved queen to marry Anne Boleyn. And she had given him only one living daughter. 4 months later, in May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested. The charges were monstrous adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George, treason, plotting to kill the king. The accusations were absurd, transparently false, and it did not matter. A jury of her peers, including men who had once dined at her table, convicted her in a single afternoon. On the morning of May 19th, Anne Boleyn was led onto a scaffold erected on Tower Green. She wore a gray gown and a crimson petticoat. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a white coif. She knelt on the straw, and a French swordsman, brought from Calais for the task, severed her head with one clean stroke. She was 35 years old. She had been queen for just 3 years. Mary did not mourn her. She could not. Anne had been the woman who destroyed her mother, humiliated her, and stolen everything she had known. But Anne's death did not restore Mary's legitimacy. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was also declared a bastard, but the damage was done. England was no longer a Catholic kingdom. The old certainties were gone, and in that fractured, blood-soaked world, a child named Jane Dormer was about to be born into a family that still believed in the old queen, the old faith, and the old God, a world that no longer existed. 2 years after Anne Boleyn's head fell, in the winter of 1538, a daughter was born to Sir William Dormer at his manor in Buckinghamshire. They named her Jane. She entered a world where faith was a death sentence and survival meant silence. Her family was Catholic gentry, old blood with deep roots in the English countryside, the kind of family that had served kings for generations without question. But questioning was no longer optional. Under Henry VIII, every household had to choose accept the king's new church or risk everything. The Dormers chose quietly. They conformed in public, attended the services they were required to attend, spoke the words they were required to speak. But behind closed doors, in a private chapel at their estate, they kept the old ways alive. They heard Mass in Latin when traveling priests dared to visit. They prayed to saints the king had banned. They taught their daughter that Catherine of Aragon had been the true queen, that her daughter Mary was the rightful heir, and that what had happened to England was not reformation but theft. Jane grew up hearing stories of what had been lost. Her family remembered the England that existed before the break with Rome, before the monasteries were gutted, before speaking the wrong prayer could cost you your life. They mourned Catherine of Aragon as if she were their own kin, and they watched Princess Mary with a kind of desperate hope, believing that one day the rightful heir would restore what her father had destroyed. But Henry was not done rewriting his kingdom. By the time Jane was a small child, he had already moved through 3 more wives. Jane Seymour had died, giving him the son he craved, Prince Edward. Anne of Cleves had been discarded after 6 months. Catherine Howard, barely older than Mary, had been dragged to the scaffold in 1542 for adultery, real or imagined. The king's court had become a place where queens rose and fell like seasons, and survival depended on knowing when to bow and when to vanish. Mary Tudor survived by withdrawing. After Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry had eventually allowed her back to court, though he never restored her legitimacy. She was useful as a diplomatic pawn, a potential bride for foreign princes, but she was never again treated as his heir. That honor belonged to Prince Edward, the sickly boy born to Jane Seymour. Mary learned to keep her head down, her faith hidden, her resentment buried deep. Jane Dormer was raised to admire that kind of loyalty, to believe that holding to the truth, even in silence, even in exile, was a form of resistance. Her family served no queen anymore, but they had not forgotten what it meant to serve one. When Henry VIII finally died in January of 1547, bloated and diseased, 9-year-old Prince Edward became king. Protestant advisers seized control. Catholic nobles were pushed aside, and Mary Tudor, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, was once again declared a threat to the throne simply for attending Mass. It was into that dangerous, fractured court that Jane Dormer would be called, not as a child, not as an observer, but as a young woman chosen to serve the one person in England who still believed the old world could be restored, the forgotten princess who refused to forget. Jane Dormer's father, Sir William Dormer, was a man caught between two worlds. He had served Henry VIII faithfully, managing estates and attending court when required. But loyalty to the crown did not mean surrender of the soul. In the Dormer household, Catholic traditions were not memories. They were acts of quiet defiance. Sir William had married Mary Sidney, a woman from another old Catholic family with connections that stretched into the highest circles of the realm. Mary Sidney was no mere country wife. She was educated, devout, and fiercely protective of the faith she had been raised in. When she gave birth to Jane in 1538, she made certain her daughter would be raised with the same unshakable conviction that had sustained Catherine of Aragon through exile and humiliation. But conviction was dangerous. By the time Jane was old enough to understand the world around her, England had become a kingdom where showing loyalty to Rome could destroy you. When Edward VI took the throne in 1547, the Protestant reformers who controlled him moved swiftly. The Latin Mass was banned. Priests who refused to use the new English prayer book were arrested. Catholic rituals, the lighting of candles for the dead, the veneration of saints, even the old holy days, were outlawed as superstition. The Dormers did what many Catholic families did. They conformed just enough to survive. They attended the required Protestant services in their parish church. They nodded when reform was praised. But in private, they held to the old faith with an intensity that bordered on recklessness. Traveling priests, operating in secret, would arrive at Dormer estates under cover of darkness to say Mass. Jane learned to recognize the signs: the sudden arrival of a stranger, the quiet gathering in the chapel, the rush to hide vestments and altar cloths if a royal inspector was spotted on the road. She also learned that her family's faith was not abstract theology. It was personal. It was bound to the memory of Catherine of Aragon and the survival of her daughter, Mary. The Dormers spoke of Mary Tudor not as a disgraced bastard princess, but as the rightful heir, the woman who would one day restore England to the faith her mother had died defending. For families like the Dormers, Mary was not just a political hope. She was a living symbol that resistance, even in silence, still mattered. Jane's upbringing was strict, deliberate, and saturated with purpose. She was taught to read and write in both English and Latin. She learned the prayers of the Rosary and the lives of martyred saints. She was trained in the skills expected of a gentlewoman: embroidery, music, household management, but also in something rarer, the ability to hold her tongue and guard secrets. In a kingdom where words could kill, silence was survival. But the Dormers did not want their daughter to simply survive. They wanted her to serve. And when the opportunity came to place Jane in the household of Princess Mary, they seized it without hesitation. It was a dangerous honor. Mary was constantly watched, her household infiltrated by spies loyal to Edward's Protestant council. Serving her meant aligning yourself with a woman the government considered a threat. Yet for families like the Dormers, there was no question. If their daughter was going to be formed by anyone, it would be by the woman who had refused to betray her mother, her faith, or her God. Jane Dormer was still a girl when she entered Mary's service. But she was already prepared for the only kind of loyalty that mattered in the Tudor court, the kind that could cost you everything. Mary Tudor's household in the early 1550s was not a court. It was a trap dressed as a refuge. When Jane Dormer arrived to serve as one of Mary's ladies-in-waiting, she found herself in a world where every visitor was noted, every letter opened, every whispered prayer reported back to Edward VI's Protestant council. Mary lived in a state of permanent siege, moving between royal estates that felt more like prisons than palaces. Her rooms were watched, her servants were questioned. Even attending Mass, the one act of faith she refused to surrender, had to be done behind locked doors with guards posted outside. Jane was likely in her early teens when she joined his household, though the exact year remains uncertain. What is documented is that she became part of a small, fiercely loyal circle of women who chose to remain with Mary despite the danger. These were not merely attendants. They were co-conspirators in an act of sustained defiance. To serve Mary was to align yourself with a woman the government considered stubborn, backward, and potentially treasonous. The princess was 35 years old when Jane entered her service, though she looked far older. Years of stress, illness, and heartbreak had carved deep lines into her face. She suffered from blinding headaches and episodes of depression, so severe she would lock herself in her chambers for days. The girl who had once been England's beloved princess, paraded through streets in cloth of gold, had become a thin, severe woman dressed in black, clutching rosary beads like a weapon. But Mary had not broken, and that fascinated Jane. The princess maintained her household with iron discipline. Prayers were said at fixed hours. Meals were formal. Behavior was strictly regulated. It was a miniature Catholic kingdom operating inside a Protestant realm, and every ritual was an act of resistance. When Mary's ladies attended her at Mass, they knew they were committing an illegal act. The Protestant council had demanded repeatedly that Mary give up her faith and conform to the new church. She had refused every time, declaring that she would rather die than deny the religion her mother had died defending. Jane witnessed this firsthand. She saw Mary face down royal commissioners sent to intimidate her. She watched the princess argue theology with Protestant bishops, citing scripture and church fathers with a precision that left educated men stammering. Mary was not a timid woman hiding in fear. She was a warrior fighting a war of patience, betting that if she could simply outlast her brother's sickly reign, she might one day reclaim what had been stolen. For Jane, serving Mary became an education in a different kind of power. Not the power of armies or proclamations, but the power of refusal. The power of saying no and meaning it, even when the cost was isolation, humiliation, and the constant threat of arrest. Mary taught her women that loyalty to God and loyalty to the true faith were the same thing. That compromise was cowardice. That holding to the truth, even in exile, was the highest form of service. Jane absorbed it all. And when Edward VI finally died in the summer of 1553, still a boy of 15, everything Jane had learned would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Because Mary Tudor was about to become queen, and Jane Dormer would be standing at her side. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553. He was 15 years old, wasted by tuberculosis, and terrified of what would happen to England if his Catholic half-sister inherited the throne. In his final weeks, he had been manipulated into altering the succession, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin with royal blood, but no legitimate claim. Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. She lasted 9 days. Mary Tudor refused to disappear. When word reached her that Edward was dying, she fled to her estates in East Anglia and raised her standard. Within days, thousands rallied to her cause, not because England loved Catholicism, but because Mary was Henry VIII's daughter, Catherine of Aragon's child, and the rightful heir. Legitimacy mattered more than theology. The Protestant council that had tried to install Jane Grey collapsed. Nobles abandoned the girl queen and rode to pledge loyalty to Mary. By the 19th of July, it was over. Mary entered London in triumph, and Jane Dormer rode with her. The procession was unlike anything England had seen in decades. Mary wore purple velvet, her thin face transformed by something close to joy. Behind her came her ladies, including Jane, dressed in the finest gowns their families could afford. Crowds lined the streets, cheering, weeping, throwing flowers. Church bells rang across the city. For one brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as though the old world had returned. Mary was crowned queen on the 1st of October at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted with all the Catholic ritual that had been banned for years. Incense filled the air. Priests chanted in Latin. The crown of England was placed on the head of a woman who had spent half her life, branded a bastard, and the other half waiting for this moment. Jane witnessed it all. She was part of the inner circle now, one of Mary's most trusted attendants. She had proven herself during the years of exile, when serving Mary meant risking everything. Now that loyalty was rewarded. Jane was given rooms at court, access to the Queen's private chambers, and a position of influence in a regime determined to undo everything Henry VIII and his son had built. Mary moved swiftly. She declared her parents' marriage valid and herself legitimate. She began dismantling the Protestant reforms, restoring the Latin Mass, reopening monasteries, and inviting exiled Catholic clergy back to England. Parliament, always willing to follow power, repealed the laws that had created the Church of England. By the end of 1553, England was officially reconciled with Rome. For families like the Dormers, it felt like resurrection. The faith they had hidden for years could now be practiced openly. Priests no longer had to slip through shadows. The Mass could be celebrated in daylight. But Mary's triumph came with a price that would stain her reign forever. She believed, with absolute conviction, that heresy was a disease and that England's soul could only be healed through fire. Protestant clergy who refused to recant were arrested. Trials began, and in February of 1555, the burning started. Jane Dormer stood at the center of a court that would come to be remembered not for its restoration, but for its cruelty. And she would have to decide what loyalty meant when the queen you served began to burn her subjects alive. While England burned and argued, Jane Dormer became something rarer than a servant. She became Mary's friend. In the Queen's private chambers, away from counselors and bishops and foreign ambassadors, Mary let the mask fall. She was not the stern, uncompromising monarch who signed death warrants and demanded religious conformity. She was a lonely woman in her late 30s, exhausted by the weight of a crown she had fought half her life to claim, terrified that everything she was trying to build would collapse the moment she died. Jane was one of the few people Mary trusted completely. While other ladies cycled in and out of favor, Jane remained constant. She attended the Queen at her morning prayers and sat with her late into the night when Mary could not sleep. She read to her, embroidered beside her, and listened when the Queen needed to speak without being overheard. Mary confided things to Jane that she could not say to her council. She spoke about her mother, Catherine of Aragon, with a grief that had not dulled in 20 years. She admitted her fears about her half-sister Elizabeth, who was being kept under watch at various estates, suspected of involvement in Protestant plots, but too dangerous to openly accuse. Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn's daughter, raised Protestant, beloved by reformers, and next in line for the throne, unless Mary could produce an heir. That obsession consumed Mary. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, a political alliance meant to bind England to the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Europe. She believed herself pregnant within months. Her body showed signs. Her stomach swelled. She felt movement. Physicians confirmed it. Preparations were made for a royal birth. Cradles were commissioned. Nurses were hired. Jane watched as the months dragged on and no child came. Mary remained in confinement, waiting, praying, desperate for the son who would secure her Catholic restoration. But there was no child. By summer of 1555, it was undeniable. The pregnancy had been phantom, a cruel trick of Mary's body and mind. The humiliation was absolute. Jane was there through all of it. She held Mary's hand when the Queen wept in private. She deflected questions from courtiers who whispered that God had cursed the marriage. She maintained the fiction of normalcy, even as Mary's health began to fail in ways that could no longer be hidden. The Queen suffered from debilitating headaches, fevers, and bouts of deep melancholy. She aged rapidly, her face gaunt, her eyes shadowed. She knew what was coming. She knew that when she died, Elizabeth would take the throne and undo everything. The monasteries would close again. The Mass would be banned again. England would return to heresy. And there was nothing Mary could do to stop it. Jane understood the weight of that despair. She had committed herself to a cause that was already dying. Mary's reign, for all its fury and conviction, was temporary. The future belonged to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, and there was no amount of loyalty or prayer that could change it. But Jane did not leave. Even as the Queen's health crumbled and the court began preparing for the inevitable transition, Jane Dormer stayed. Because loyalty, in the end, was not about winning. It was about refusing to abandon someone when everyone else already had. By 1558, Mary Tudor was 42 years old and dying by inches. The second phantom pregnancy had destroyed whatever remained of her physical strength. In 1557, she had convinced herself again that she was carrying Philip's child. Again, her body had betrayed her. The Spanish king, humiliated and frustrated, had left England and would never return. Mary was alone, childless, and facing the one truth she had spent her entire reign trying to deny. Elizabeth would inherit the throne. Her half-sister was 24 years old, clever, calculating, and everything Mary was not. Where Mary was rigid and devout, Elizabeth was flexible and pragmatic. Where Mary had alienated her people with burnings and a Spanish marriage, Elizabeth had carefully cultivated an image of English loyalty and Protestant moderation. She was Anne Boleyn's daughter, and that fact alone guaranteed that the moment she took the crown, Mary's entire Catholic restoration would be dismantled. Mary knew it, and it was killing her faster than any disease. Through the spring and summer of 1558, the Queen grew weaker. She suffered from what physicians called a tumor in her abdomen, though the exact nature of her illness remains debated. Some historians believe it was ovarian cancer. Others suggest a uterine tumor or severe infection. What is certain is that she was in constant pain, feverish, and unable to eat without nausea. She spent days in bed, unable to attend Mass or receive ambassadors. Her council began preparing for the transition. Quietly and carefully, they sent messages to Elizabeth at Hatfield, assuring her of their loyalty once the inevitable happened. Courtiers who had served Mary for years began making excuses to leave court, claiming estates needed attention or family matters required their presence. They did not want to be associated with a dying regime. Jane Dormer watched them go. She saw the way men who had bowed and sworn loyalty to Mary now whispered in corridors about Elizabeth's tastes, Elizabeth's advisors, Elizabeth's plans. The court was already moving on, and the Queen was still breathing. Mary was not blind to it. She knew she was being abandoned. In her more lucid moments, she dictated letters to Philip, begging him to return, to protect England from heresy after her death. He did not come. She summoned her council and tried to force them to swear they would uphold the Catholic faith under Elizabeth. They gave vague assurances and changed nothing. The only thing Mary could still control was who stayed in her chambers. And Jane Dormer stayed. While others fled to secure their futures, Jane remained at the Queen's bedside. She helped Mary sit up when the pain became unbearable. She read psalms aloud when the Queen could not sleep. She prayed the rosary with her in the early hours of the morning when Mary woke in terror, convinced she could hear her mother's voice calling from the next room. It was not duty anymore. It was witness. Jane was watching a woman who had fought for 30 years to restore her mother's honor and her faith, only to realize that the moment she closed her eyes for the last time, everything she had built would be erased by the daughter of the woman who had destroyed it all. Anne Boleyn's ghost was about to inherit England, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the end. November came cold and grey to London. Mary Tudor was confined to her chambers at St. James's Palace, and the city beyond her windows was already preparing for a different queen. Jane Dormer was not alone in her vigil, but the circle around Mary had shrunk to almost nothing. Susan Clarenceau, another lady-in-waiting who had served since the dark days before Mary's accession, remained. A handful of priests moved in and out, hearing the Queen's confession and bringing her communion. A few physicians attended, though there was nothing left they could do except measure the hours. Everyone else had found reasons to be elsewhere. The contrast was brutal. At Hatfield, Elizabeth's household swelled daily with new arrivals. Nobles who had spent 5 years bowing to Mary now rode north to pledge themselves to her successor. They brought gifts, promises, and carefully worded apologies for past allegiances. Elizabeth received them all with gracious smiles and the memory that forgot nothing. Jane heard the reports. Messengers came and went, carrying letters between the two courts. Mary's counselors were already negotiating the terms of the succession, making certain Elizabeth understood their willingness to serve. They spoke of continuity and stability, as if the woman dying upstairs had already ceased to exist. Mary was aware of all of it. On her better days, she would ask Jane to read aloud the messages from Hatfield. She listened in silence as Elizabeth sent formal wishes for the Queen's health, letters so carefully phrased they revealed nothing. Mary knew what was being said between the lines. She was an obstacle now, and the kingdom was simply waiting for her to finish dying. But Mary was not ready. She clung to life with a ferocity that startled even her physicians. She would rally for a day or two, sitting up in bed, insisting on hearing Mass, dictating instructions to counselors she knew would ignore them the moment she was gone. Then the fever would return, the pain would sharpen, and she would collapse back into semi-consciousness. Jane stayed through all of it. She learned to read the rhythms of Mary's suffering, to know when the Queen needed silence and when she needed the sound of a familiar voice. She became expert at small comforts, adjusting pillows, dampening cloths for the fever, holding a cup steady when Mary's hands shook too much to drink. There were moments of clarity that were harder than the delirium. Mary would look at Jane with eyes that understood exactly what was happening and say things that could not be repeated. She spoke about her mother's final days at Kimbleton, wondering if Catherine had felt this same bitter knowledge that everything she had suffered for would be undone. She mentioned Elizabeth only once, calling her "that woman's daughter," and then fell silent, as if even speaking the name required more strength than she had left. Jane never argued. She never offered false hope. She simply stayed. On the 13th of November, Mary added a codicil to her will. In it, she acknowledged Elizabeth as her heir. It was the final surrender, the last act of a woman who had run out of options. She signed it with a shaking hand and then turned her face to the wall. 4 days later, in the early hours of the morning, Mary Tudor would die, and Jane Dormer would be there to close her eyes. Mary Tudor died just before dawn on the 17th of November, 1558. She was 42 years old, and she died as she had lived, refusing to surrender, even when there was nothing left to hold. Jane Dormer was in the room when it happened. The Queen's breathing had grown shallow in the night, each breath a rasping struggle. The priests had administered the last rites hours earlier, anointing her with holy oil and commending her soul to God. Mary had been conscious enough to respond, whispering the prayers in Latin, her lips moving even when no sound came out. As the darkness began to pale toward morning, Mary's eyes opened one final time. She looked toward the small altar that had been set up in her chamber, where candles burned before a crucifix. Her lips moved as if in prayer, though no words emerged. Then her gaze shifted to Jane, standing beside the bed. For a moment, there was recognition, a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, or relief, or simply acknowledgement that someone had stayed. Then Mary's eyes closed, her breathing stopped, and the last Catholic Queen of England was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Jane stood frozen, watching the still form of the woman she had served through triumph and collapse. The priests began their prayers for the dead. Susan Clarenceau wept quietly in the corner. But Jane remained dry-eyed, staring at the reality she had known was coming, but could not quite believe had arrived. Mary's death changed nothing and everything. Within hours, messengers were racing toward Hatfield to inform Elizabeth that she was now queen. Bells began to toll across London, the slow, measured rhythm announcing the end of one reign and the beginning of another. By midday, Elizabeth had been proclaimed, and courtiers who had avoided St. James's Palace for weeks suddenly flooded back, eager to be seen mourning appropriately before heading north to pledge loyalty to the new monarch. But before any of that, there was a private duty that fell to Jane alone. Mary had left specific instructions. Among her final bequests was a collection of royal jewels, rings, necklaces, brooches of immense value and historical significance. These were not personal trinkets. They were symbols of queenship, heirlooms that had passed through generations of English monarchs. Mary could have withheld them out of spite, could have ordered them sent to Philip in Spain or distributed to Catholic allies. Instead, she had chosen honor. She had entrusted them to Jane Dormer, with orders to deliver them personally to Elizabeth. It was a test, a final measure of loyalty, not to a cause or a faith, but to the crown itself. Mary was asking Jane to walk into the court of Anne Boleyn's daughter, carrying the treasures of Catherine of Aragon's line, and place them into the hands of the woman who represented everything Mary had spent her life opposing. Jane accepted the charge without question. She wrapped the jewels carefully, secured them in a locked casket, and prepared to face the woman who would erase everything Mary had tried to build. The dead queen's last command would be obeyed, even if it meant kneeling before the enemy. The journey to Hatfield took less than a day, but it felt like crossing into another country. Jane Dormer traveled with a small escort, the casket of jewels secured in her keeping. As her horse carried her north through the November cold, she watched the landscape transform. Villages that had been silent and tense under Mary's final days now erupted with celebration. Bonfires burned in town squares. Ale flowed freely. People danced and sang, not in mourning for the dead queen, but in joy for the living one. England was relieved. That was the truth Jane had to swallow. They were not mourning Mary. They were celebrating her death. When she arrived at Hatfield Palace, the scene was chaos. The courtyard overflowed with nobles, their servants, their horses, their desperate eagerness to be seen and remembered. Elizabeth had been queen for less than 48 hours, and already the court was rebuilding itself around her. Jane recognized faces, men who had served Mary, who had sworn oaths to uphold the Catholic faith, now pushing forward to offer themselves to a Protestant queen. She was shown into the great hall and told to wait. Elizabeth did not make her wait long. The new queen entered the room with a confidence that stopped conversation. She was 25 years old, tall and slender, dressed in black as propriety demanded, but with her red gold hair uncovered, a statement of vitality against the mourning cloth. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging every face, every gesture, missing nothing. When her gaze landed on Jane, there was a flicker of recognition. Elizabeth knew exactly who Jane Dormer was. Mary's loyal attendant, the girl who had stayed when others fled. Jane stepped forward and knelt, offering the casket. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady, "Queen Mary, of blessed memory, commanded that these be delivered to you." Elizabeth took the casket herself, unlocking it with hands that did not tremble. Inside, the jewels gleamed rubies, pearls, emeralds set in gold, pieces that had adorned queens for generations. She lifted a ring, examined it in the light, and then looked down at Jane, still kneeling. "Your loyalty to my sister does you credit," Elizabeth said. Her voice was measured, giving nothing away. "Such devotion is rare." It was not quite a compliment. It was an acknowledgment of something dangerous. Jane had proven she could be loyal unto death to a queen the world had turned against. That made her either valuable or a threat, and Elizabeth had not yet decided which. "I trust," Elizabeth continued, replacing the ring and closing the casket, "that the same loyalty might be offered to me." It was a test, an invitation and a warning delivered in a single sentence. Jane could stay, could serve this new queen, could transfer her allegiance from the mother's faith to the daughter's. All she had to do was say yes. Jane rose from her knees, met Elizabeth's eyes, and in that moment made a choice that would define the rest of her life. "I am honored by your Majesty's kindness," she said carefully, "but my service was to Queen Mary alone." The room went silent. Elizabeth's expression did not change, but something shifted in her gaze. She understood what was being said. Jane Dormer would not be bought, would not be turned, would not pretend that serving Elizabeth was the same as serving Mary. "I see," Elizabeth said softly, and then she dismissed her with a nod. Jane left Hatfield that same day, knowing she would never return. Jane Dormer returned to her family estates in Buckinghamshire, carrying a reputation that made her both admired and unmarriageable. She was 20 years old, beautiful by all accounts, and from a family with wealth and connections. Under normal circumstances, she would have been besieged by suitors. But these were not normal circumstances. Jane had made it clear to the most powerful woman in England that her loyalty could not be purchased or transferred. That kind of defiance marked you. Elizabeth moved quickly to reshape her kingdom. Within weeks of her coronation, she began appointing Protestant advisers and clergy. The Latin Mass, restored under Mary, was once again pushed aside in favor of the English prayer book. Catholic bishops who refused to swear the oath of supremacy, acknowledging Elizabeth as supreme governor of the Church, were removed from their posts and replaced with reformers. The religious pendulum was swinging again, and anyone caught on the wrong side faced isolation at best, imprisonment at worst. Jane's family understood the danger. The Dormers had survived Henry's break with Rome, Edward's Protestant reforms, and Mary's Catholic restoration by being quietly adaptable. But their daughter had just publicly refused the new queen. That was not quiet. That was not adaptable. That was the kind of gesture that drew unwanted attention from a government paranoid about Catholic plots and foreign invasion. Yet Jane would not bend. She attended Mass in secret, hosted traveling priests at the family estate, and maintained correspondence with other Catholic families who were navigating the same treacherous ground. She was doing exactly what Mary had done during Edward's reign, creating a small, defiant pocket of the old faith in a kingdom determined to erase it. Suitors came anyway. Some were opportunists, attracted by her family's wealth and willing to overlook her dangerous convictions. Others were fellow Catholics, men who saw in Jane a rare example of open resistance and wanted to bind their families to that courage. Jane refused them all. She had not stayed loyal to Mary through exile and death only to marry some minor English nobleman and spend the rest of her life pretending to conform. Then, in the spring of 1559, a different kind of suitor arrived. His name was Gomez Suarez de Figueroa y Cordoba, Count of Feria, and he was one of the most powerful men in the Spanish court. He had served as an advisor to King Philip II and had been Spain's ambassador to England during Mary's final years. He had been present at court, had witnessed Mary's collapse, and had seen Jane Dormer's unwavering loyalty firsthand. More importantly, he had been given explicit instructions by Mary herself, whispered to him during one of her final lucid moments. If anything happened to her, Mary had told him he was to take care of Jane Dormer, to protect her from what was coming. Feria had not forgotten. And when he returned to England on diplomatic business in the early months of Elizabeth's reign, he sought Jane out not as an ambassador, but as a man with a purpose. He offered her something no English suitor could escape. The Count of Feria was 40 years old, a widower, and one of the most influential advisors in King Philip's inner circle. He was sophisticated, educated, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply Catholic. He was also offering Jane something that went far beyond the conventional arrangements of Tudor marriages. He was offering her a life where she would never have to hide her faith again. Feria had watched Jane during Mary's final months. He had seen her remain at the dying queen's bedside while others calculated their futures elsewhere. He had witnessed her deliver the royal jewels to Elizabeth with dignity, and he had heard about her refusal to enter the new queen's service. In a court built on compromise and self-preservation, Jane Dormer's integrity stood out like a lit candle in a dark room. But his interest was not purely admiration. Feria was a practical man serving a Catholic king who viewed Protestant England as both a threat and an opportunity. A marriage to one of Mary Tudor, as most loyal ladies-in-waiting, would create a living connection to the old Catholic regime. Jane would become a symbol, a reminder that not everyone in England had abandoned the true faith. More importantly, she would become a conduit for information, a trusted contact for English Catholics who might need Spanish support in the dangerous years ahead. Jane understood all of this. She was not naive about what the marriage represented politically, but she also recognized what it offered personally freedom. In Spain, she could attend Mass openly. She could live without fear of midnight arrests or accusations of treason. She could maintain her loyalty to Mary's memory without constantly looking over her shoulder. And she would be protected by one of the most powerful men in the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Europe. There was also the matter of Feria himself. He was not young, and he was not offering romance. But he was respectful, intelligent, and genuinely committed to the same faith that had defined Jane's entire life. He treated her not as a political acquisition, but as an equal, someone whose judgment and loyalty were worth preserving. The courtship was brief. Feria could not remain in England indefinitely, and both of them understood that the longer Jane stayed, the more dangerous her position became. Elizabeth's government was already beginning to tighten restrictions on Catholics. Fines were being imposed for not attending Protestant services. Networks of informers were being established. It was only a matter of time before open adherence to the old faith became impossible. In December of 1558, barely a month after Mary's death, Jane Dormer and the Count of Feria were married in a quiet Catholic ceremony. It was conducted in Latin, with a priest who would have been arrested if discovered. The guest list was small, limited to family and trusted friends. There was no grand celebration, no public announcement. It was a wedding performed in defiance, a final act of resistance before leaving England forever. Elizabeth was informed, of course. Her spies reported everything. But she did not interfere. Perhaps she saw it as a convenient solution, one of Mary's most visible loyalists removing herself from England voluntarily. Or perhaps she understood that stopping the marriage would create a martyr, and Elizabeth preferred her enemies safely exiled rather than dangerously imprisoned. Either way, Jane Dormer was now the Countess of Feria, and her life in England was over. Jane Dormer left England in the early months of 1559, sailing from Dover with her new husband and a small party of attendants. She was 20 years old, and she would never see her homeland again. The crossing to Calais was rough, the winter sea battering their ship as they pushed toward the continent. Jane stood on deck as the white cliffs faded into gray mist, watching England disappear. Everything she had known, her family's estates, the villages where she had grown up, the palaces where she had served Mary, all of it slipped away into the distance. She was leaving behind her parents, her siblings, the graves of everyone she had served and loved. But she was also leaving behind a kingdom that no longer had room for people like her. The journey through France and into Spain took weeks. They traveled by carriage through countryside, still scarred by religious wars, passing through towns where Catholics and Protestants had slaughtered each other in the name of God. Europe was fracturing along the same fault lines that had split England, and everywhere Jane looked, She saw the cost of choosing faith over survival. Spain, when they finally reached it, was a different world. The court of King Philip II was the most powerful Catholic stronghold in Europe, a kingdom where the Inquisition enforced religious orthodoxy with ruthless efficiency. Churches stood open and uncontested. Monasteries functioned without fear of dissolution. The Mass was celebrated daily in Latin, with all the ritual and ceremony that had been banned in England. For Jane, it was both liberation and loss. She could finally practice her faith openly, without hiding or fear. But she was also in exile, cut off from everything familiar, living in a foreign land where she barely spoke the language. Feria brought her to his estates in Andalusia, vast holdings that stretched across sun-baked hills dotted with olive groves and vineyards. The heat was oppressive compared to England's damp cold. The food was strange. The customs were unfamiliar. Jane had to learn Spanish, learn the rhythms of the Spanish court, learn to navigate a society where she was both honored as a countess and watched as a foreigner. But she adapted. She always had. Within months, English Catholics began seeking her out. Priests who had fled Elizabeth's regime. Nobles who had lost everything rather than conform. Scholars and exiles who needed refuge, money, or simply a connection to someone who understood what they had sacrificed. Jane's household in Spain became a gathering place, a small pocket of exiled England where the old faith was still spoken of with reverence, and Mary Tudor was remembered as a martyr rather than a failure. Jane used her position carefully. She corresponded with Catholic families still in England, sending money and support when she could. She interceded with Spanish authorities on behalf of refugees. She maintained a network of contacts that stretched from Madrid to Rome, becoming a quiet but influential voice for English Catholics in exile. She also wrote letters, memoirs, accounts of Mary's final years that preserved the Queen's memory in ways the official English histories would not. She told the story of a woman who had refused to abandon her faith, who had fought to restore what her father had destroyed, and who had died knowing she had failed, but unwilling to surrender. Jane Dormer had become the keeper of a lost queen's legacy, and in doing so, she had found a purpose that went beyond survival. She had chosen loyalty over a kingdom, and somehow she had lived to tell the story. Jane Dormer lived in Spain for 53 years, long enough to see everything she had fought against become permanent, long enough to outlive every enemy and every ally, long enough to become a legend. The Count of Feria died in 1567, leaving Jane a widow at 29. She inherited his title, becoming the Duchess of Feria, and with it came wealth, estates, and influence that few women in Europe commanded. She could have remarried. Powerful men made offers. She refused them all. She had married once for faith and duty. That was enough. Instead, she threw herself into the work that had become her calling. Her estates became sanctuaries for English Catholics fleeing persecution. Jesuit priests trained on the continent passed through her household before attempting dangerous missions back to England. She funded seminaries, supported scholars, and maintained connections with the Vatican itself. Popes wrote to her, seeking her counsel on English affairs. Spanish kings consulted her about the situation in the country she had left behind. And all the while, Elizabeth ruled England. The two women never met again after that brief encounter at Hatfield, but their lives remained strangely intertwined. Elizabeth knew about Jane's activities in Spain. Her spies reported every letter, every visiting priest, every connection to the English Catholic underground. But Elizabeth never moved against her directly. Perhaps because Jane was safely abroad. Perhaps because making a martyr of Mary Tudor's most faithful servant would accomplish nothing. They even corresponded occasionally, stiff formal letters that revealed nothing and said everything. Jane maintained a careful respect for Elizabeth's position as queen, while never wavering in her own Catholic convictions. Elizabeth, for her part, acknowledged Jane's loyalty to Mary without ever asking her to transfer it. The years passed. Elizabeth's reign stretched on 45 years of calculated survival, of playing enemies against each other, of refusing to name an heir until the very end. She became Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who had secured Protestant England and made it a power. Everything Mary had tried to restore remained buried. But Elizabeth died in 1603, and Jane Dormer was still alive. She was 65 years old when news reached Spain that Anne Boleyn's daughter had finally closed her eyes. Jane had outlived them all, Henry. Catherine, Mary, Anne, Elizabeth. Everyone who had shaped the world she was born into was gone, and she remained. She lived 9 more years, dying in 1612 at the age of 74. By then, England had a new king, James I, and the religious battles of the Tudor era had faded into history. The world had moved on, but Jane Dormer had never moved on. Until her final breath, she attended daily mass, prayed for Mary Tudor's soul, and told anyone who would listen about the Queen who had been erased from England's memory. She dictated her recollections to her confessor, preserving details that would have been lost forever. She kept Mary alive in the only way left through witness. The lady-in-waiting who refused to abandon a dying queen had become the woman who refused to let that queen be forgotten. She had survived by choosing loyalty over power, exile over compromise, memory over erasure. And in the end, that was the only kind of victory that mattered.